man who dares to do this and brings. And though I was aware that he was playing the Webern very well, I wasn't.
But the next player also impressed me with a very imaginative reading of, again, a classic work, the Haydn.
Well, you see, now here's this man, Lars Vogt, who's only 19 and comes onto, he loves being a concert artist. He comes onto the concert platform as if he owns it, it's his domain, and before he even starts to play, you're eager to hear what he has to offer. And the Haydn was marvellous. There was a wonderfully witty and mercurial last movement. Fantastic.
Well, I think that point comes across very clearly in this moment that we're going to hear from his Haydn performance. Now there, Paul, was a pianist who I reckoned had, as it were, sussed out the hall. He knew how to use the acoustics to his advantage, in a sense.
Well, you see, and that's again the mark of a concert artist, to know how to take charge of the circumstances you find yourself in. You know, the acoustic of Leeds Town Hall is very swimmy. People listening to it at home won't realise that, because over the mics it comes over clearly. In fact, I hope at this point that when the 1993 competition comes around, there'll be a new concert hall in Leeds. It's talked about, and I hope it's here. I was sitting with the jury, and I could see his feet as well as his hands. What a pianist does with his feet is just as important as what he does with his hands. And he didn't use the soft pedal at all in the first three pieces. He only used it in sorts of pictures and exhibition, and then only twice. But he has such fantastic control in the fingers, and it's a very beautiful piano here in Leeds, but he was able to do it all with the fingers, and it was really a rather remarkable feat.
Well, I talked to Lars Vogt about the acoustics, and indeed his choice of repertoire. The other pieces you put in the programme, you ended with the Mussorgsky.
Yes.
You must have been quite tired by the end of that, I should think.
That's true, that's true. This is, of course, a very exhausting program. Already the Brahms, it needs so much attention from inside. And then the whole Mussorgsky. Of course, it's nearly impossible to be all the time concentrated in the same way. There are some times in between when you're a little bit, and you cannot concentrate so well. With me in the Brahms, for a moment I was nearly not there. The air was also a little bit strange. It seemed that it was very dry, and it took everything from your brain a little bit. But then in Mussorgsky it became better again.
Now, my colleague Paul Crossley, who is a pianist who's watching the competition with me, was very interested to notice that you use the soft pedal Very sparingly.
Yes.
I think he thought only twice you
Yes.
used it. Is that deliberate?
Sometimes I even didn't use it this time when it was demanded by the composer. For example, in the Unhatched Chicks of the Mussorgsky, I only used it for a few bars. Well, it's I did this especially for this hall and this piano. And this piano, you can make a very beautiful piano and pianissimo without this left pedal. And I know from listening in the hall, to a rehearsal of somebody else, that it's very dangerous to play very pianissimo in this hall because the sound is at once away, gone.
Well, I just had a message to say the Duchess is almost ready, so we've got to drop the Mussorgsky chickens, drop the Mussorgsky Gate of Kiev played by Lars Vogt, but we can at least make the point in words, can't we? How he used the pedalling to his advantage in those
Well, you see,
pieces.
when in fact he did use the soft pedal, which he used in the Ballet of the Unhatched Chicks and the Mussorgsky, it was an absolutely sort of magical moment. And I'm sorry we're not in the Great Gate of Kiev, because we've been talking about his subtlety and his very fine ear. In fact, he has all the grandeur and power when it's needed, as I'm sure we shall hear in the Schumann now.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, we are going to hear him quite a lot now, so how do you think the powers of expression that you've been talking about, especially through the acoustic, will aid him, compared perhaps to Hai-Sun Pek, who's already had to deal with them?
I think he's apparently quite very experienced at playing with orchestra, and I think you're going to hear all the exchanges with the orchestra done in a very subtle way. I have high hopes for what's going to happen in the transition between the slow movement and the last movement.
Well, we were all beetling around this morning. We've been beetling around all week, in fact, but while we were this morning, I heard a bit of the rehearsal, and it seemed to me they were going a mite faster than the other performance in the Schumann.
In what? In the last movement? In the slow movement?
Well, the whole performance seemed to go quicker.
It wouldn't surprise me at all because it's a very mercurial temperament. I mean, he's got masses of technique. That won't going a little faster wouldn't fuss him at all.
And self-confidence and charisma, I'd say.
Oh, I think he has a lot of charisma. I mean, I don't know what this performance is going to be like now. As I say, I have high hopes of it from what I've heard so far.
It's interesting, isn't it, to compare somebody like him with the Pole, who's very reserved and very shy, but has also got musical charisma.
He has musical charisma, and that it's that incredible intellectual strength is, I think, one of the things that's sadly missing from this final.
Right. Well, the leader of the City of Birmingham Symphony Orchestra is back in his place, and now we await the arrival of the Duchess of Kent. Here she is, for part 2 of this evening's finals from Leeds of the International Piano Competition. I see she's now sitting next to Marion Thorpe, who was one of the co-founders of this competition. And now, here is Lars Vogt and Simon Rattle for the second performance of the Schumann Piano Concerto in A minor, Opus 54, a chance for you to listen and compare. Well, you don't have to be a genius to recognize a performance of stature and individuality. And in that performance, from Lars Vogt to the Schumann Piano Concerto in A minor, Opus 54, I would say that that is what we had. It seemed to me, we'll hear in a moment from Paul Crossley if he agrees, that that inspired Simon Rattle and the CBSO to real heights of music making. But let me say straight away, there are some big guns coming tomorrow this competition is not over by any means. But that doesn't really matter. What matters is that we hear some wonderful music making. And that's why I am excited by what I've just heard. Lars Vogt was born in Düren in West Germany. He studied at the Hochschule für Musik in Hanover, and amongst his teachers was Karl-Heinz Kemmerling, who was one of the judges here a few years ago. Lars Vogt has in fact won 1 or 2 prizes already, but I think this is really one of the first big competitions he's gone in for. If so, he's timed it rather well. Well, now it's time for the Duchess to depart, to return, I hope, tomorrow evening when she'll hear the next 3 pianists. I hope she feels that she's had a good evening's of music. There she goes, filing past the jury who sit just in front of her in the gallery. We were a little bit nervous at the start since she flew here and everything was timed to an absolute fraction of a second, but it all worked very smoothly.
Well, Paul, have I been overreacting, or do you think that really was a wonderful piece of playing?
I think it was a dream of a performance. And you see, when somebody plays as well as that, the orchestra's having a fabulous time. And I play with Simon enough times to see when he's having a whale of a time. I mean, everything was lifted. You see, that man has bags of personality and all the technique to carry it out. Incidentally, all those miraculous changes of colour that you heard, not once again did he ever use the soft pedal. So all that quiet, wonderful, magic floating sound was just done with the fingers.
His foot was tucked right under.
His foot was tucked right under. It never even once tried to come out and touch that soft pedal at all. But do you see how even when he makes all these minute gradations of colour, and even when the ideas are sort of bursting, there's always a driving purpose to the thing. It's always moving forward. It had fantastic shape.
But the other thing that he was doing was that he was listening to the clarinet, the oboe, and then colouring his reply in the dialogue.
Right. Yes. I mean, I'm absolutely certain that all sorts of things were happening in that performance that none of them had thought about. I mean, well, that is what music making is all about.
But I mean, I am right, aren't I, that also that there are tomorrow performers, well, of equal stature, perhaps.
Yes, I think there's one performer certainly of equal stature tomorrow.
We won't give that away yet.
We won't give that away yet. I mean, I don't know where this man is going to be placed. I think very high indeed. I also don't think it matters how high he's placed, because I think he's shown himself and proved himself. Now, I should think he's going places.
Well, Paul Crossley, thank you so much. You've been very helpful. I hope you'll continue to be so tomorrow.
I hope so.
And tomorrow...
On 88.